Hello, thank you so much for being here for this presentation. I would like to focus my attention on English language learners and long-term memory and retrieval practices. And first, I'd like to just give you a quick overview and introduction to English language learners, probably information that you already know. As you can see from this graphic, English language learners are among the largest growing groups of student population within the United States, and this is according to the Department of Education. Most public schools within the United States really see an increase in ELL enrollment, and this can be from 1% to 24% across the United States. So my question to you is, really, what are school building administrators and local municipalities and representatives doing to really best serve this group of students, or English language learners? This is something that you should keep in mind as we continue with this as I continue with this presentation. So I'm going to focus my attention on long-term memory and retrieval practices, and I'm going to just quickly go over these two terms that are important to note. So first, long-term memory really allows for large chunks of information to be stored, for long periods of time. Retrieval practices really are steps or processes to help with the recuperation of that information. Also important to keep in mind. When people are asked to retrieve information, they usually look for logical places in their mind. So usually that information is organized and succinctly and methodically placed there. But in order for it to be placed succinctly and methodically, it's really important that the information is practiced and is given ample opportunity to really be hashed and memorized and learned, so that that retrieval can take place. For example, after writing down a story, students should be encouraged to share with peers. And if corrected by a teacher or given feedback, it's an added plus to the learning and material for when test day arrives. I'm going to focus on the theory of successful intelligence for just a moment, and I'm going to highlight some of the aspects of this theory. For example, intelligence is defined in terms of the ability to achieve success in life and in terms of one's standards with one's cultural context, and this is according to Robert Sternberg from 2003. Also, he believed that intelligence itself is captured and interpreted through a social cultural context. Success in and of itself is defined by the individual attempting to achieve the goals that must be set to meet the desired output. Having the capacity to differentiate and acknowledge one's weakness and strengths helps one capitalize on those weaknesses and, on those strengths and those innate abilities. So it's really important to keep in mind as well. And attaining success through analytical, practical, and creative abilities just means that we are going to have to focus on all of the strengths that ELs possess, not just one area. It's important to look at the whole child. So moving into some really important aspects, ELs can really acquire English through long-term memory and retrieval practices, and here are just some key points. So first, we're going to focus on constant training. Thank you for your patience. So with constant training, we really talk about the ability of a student to be exposed, or the ability to expose a student to information over and over again. And many studies have been conducted where there have been multiple groups, one experimental group and a control group, and the experimental group really was, for example, the group that got the change or got the repetitiveness when it came to new learning, and the control group did not. And the researchers found out that really the group with the experimental group really benefited from that rote exposure, that constant exposure to information. On the contrary, there was a study where 251 Spanish-speaking students, where they identified that the cognitive deficits that existed in EL's primary language really actually transferred over into the language that they were trying to acquire. So the students' long-term memory and retrieval techniques were really null and void because of the deficiencies beyond anyone's control. So it's really important to identify if an English language learner truly has the ability to retrieve and place that information that they're learning in their long-term ability, or is there something else that we need to look at to help the students achieve? Is it a language issue, or is it something else? And that's also important to note. Moving into the next aspect is really using technology to enhance learning. And technology really goes in straight connection with constant practice, because even with the programs that are administered in schools, if students are given ample opportunity to really use that program successfully, it's more likely for that student, especially the English language learners, to be able to, one, take that information and move it into the long-term memory, and then later retrieve it from the long-term memory. But without that constant practice, this technique would also be null and void. There are differences between reading comprehension and listening comprehension, and theoretically the methods used, both reading and listening comprehension are important. Students need, though, to listen to comprehend. However, it would seem that with reading comprehension, students simply got the text of the gist of the text, and they really didn't delve deep into the details. So this shows that ELs, for example, who practice or participate in listening comprehension over long periods of time will actually retain more in a short-term session and less when it comes to their long-term memory and retrieval capabilities. That's something to keep in mind as well. So ELs can also acquire English through long-term memory and retrieval practices, and this has to do with multiple and frequent encounters with English vocabulary. Huge and very important. And one of those ways to acquire that English vocabulary is possibly at bilingual education. And when students have the ability to produce words as part of the process of acquiring a new language, that input of it in and of itself actually does not result in the same level of language proficiency as does input plus output. So that's important to also keep in mind as educators, especially educators who are teaching diverse groups of students, including English language learners. And there's also, for example, a study that tracked adult English language learners, and this study found that although the discrepancy in age and maturity matters, both studies, and all these studies really pointed out that both children and adults who participate we have to look at the history of the language deficits that were not identified, and if those deficits are not taken care of, sometimes they can be misleading or misinterpreted, and sometimes we think it's one thing when it's really not. So it's important really to look at to understand why is it that a student doesn't have organizational skills that they need to meet the demand of retrieval from their long-term memory. Very important to keep in mind. Some basic implications for all educators, really first and foremost, is that students must have the opportunity to practice repeated skills and concepts before that information can really be moved into long-term memory. And I know as educators we're pressed for time, and this is one area that I just want to say, even me as I'm speaking, I'm pressed for time, but truly, allowing information to be repeated over and over again is so truly important for English language learners specifically. And secondly, fear not technology. As an educator looking for new and improved ways of helping ELs, it's imperative to utilize technology and help students acquire language. But remember, consistent and constant practice. Thirdly, although reading and listening comprehension can be equally tricky for ELs to ascertain, exposing students to both forms of comprehension over long periods of time is crucial for long-term memory and retrieval practices. Finally, understanding that students need multiple encounters with the same concept before long-term memory and retrieval practices are practical tools is essential to keep in mind. So I'm just going to leave that with you, and I hope that you use these strategies regardless what school-age children you teach or work with, because at the end of the day, all students have to learn, and I know that we can help all students, especially English language learners, achieve maximum results. And in this case, we're going to help our English language learners achieve maximum results through long-term memory and retrieval practices. Thank you so much for your attention during this presentation.